Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait a couple minutes and make sure everybody is joined in, and then we'll get started. Super. I think everybody's got a couple of people still connecting to audio, so we'll let that get through and then we'll get going. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Heather Corbett. I'm lucky enough to work here with the alumni engagement team here at Bates. And I'm pleased that so many of you can attend this inaugural program in our Alumni Professional Development Series, which is a collaboration between us in Alumni Engagement and with Lighthouse Career Associates, who's led by Bates' own Ann Shields, class of 1980, and parent of Keenan, class of 2018. Wanted to give everybody a few housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, I want to make sure everyone knows that the program is being recorded today. If during the presentation you prefer either gallery view or speaker view, know that you can toggle that in the upper corner of your screen. Out of respect for our presenter, everyone will be muted during the presentation, and you can unmute yourself during the breakout rooms. And during the Q&A, please either use the raise your hand function or enter your question into the chat, and we'll either call on you or read your question aloud. So with all of that housekeeping stuff behind us, it's my pleasure to introduce Melissa Haveman, who's an organizational psychologist and an ICF certified leadership and team coach. She specializes in working with creative professionals and leaders, as well as with teams that want to be more innovative. Melissa's background includes 20 years as a nonfiction ghostwriter and a stint as the director of curriculum for an edtech startup. In her spare time, she writes short mystery fiction, fosters kittens for a local rescue, and enjoys hiking through Michigan, where she lives. Please join me in welcoming Melissa to this program. Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks, Heather. All right, I think Meredith is going to share the screen, and I will adjust my screen, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for having me. All right, so creating a culture of teamwork is one of the greatest challenges organizations are facing. When we think of teamwork, we think it's simple, right? We show up, we work together, we get the results we need. Most of us have experienced various forms of teams throughout our lifetimes, from sports teams to work teams. However, most of us don't receive a lot of training or instruction on how to actually function within a team. Think about those sports teams that have traded or signed a few really talented players, and excitement builds, and they think that it's going to be the secret to finally getting that championship. How often does that strategy really work? In a few cases it does, but often it fails. We sometimes blame it on a lack of chemistry, but really that's just a code for people not knowing how to team together to achieve the desired results. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to achieve that chemistry, how to become a better teammate, and how to lead teams that achieve results. And we're going to start out, Meredith, if you can give us the next slide. We're going to start out with a couple of questions and do a little survey together. There are 5 questions, and what I'm going to have you do is, oh, and my screens just went crazy. There we go. So when I ask a question, please think of your response and type it into chat, but don't hit send yet. I'll count down, and we'll have everyone submit their responses at the same time in chat, so nobody gets to cheat on their response. And you can tally up how different your response was from the actual findings of the survey, and we'll give bragging rights to whoever was closest. So our first survey question: when coworkers admit their mistakes, does this make you trust them more? All right, 3, 2, 1, post it. And Meredith, we can go to the next screen. So 84% said yes. And the survey was done by about, I think it was 4,000 people across a variety of industries. So 84% said, when my coworkers admit their mistakes, it makes me trust them more. All right, let's go on to the next question. Do you think your workplace would be more effective if people were more frank with their opinions? So what percentage do you think answered yes on that? Okay, 3, 2, 1, post it. All right, Meredith, the next slide, please. 71% said yes. So if people were more frank with their opinions, 71% said that would improve their workplace. And our next question, do you sometimes feel that team projects suffer because people aren't committed enough? What percentage of people do you think answered yes? 3, 2, 1, and post it. All right, Meredith, give us the answer. 86% said yes. So many of us have experienced those team projects that suffer because our teammates aren't committed enough. And sometimes it's us that's not committed enough. All right, our next question, and this is question number 4. Would your work team be more effective if people were better at holding one another accountable? What percentage said yes? So 3, 2, 1, and post it. Oh, lots of difference in the answers. All right, Meredith, give us the answer. 89% said yes. It seems like a really large number on that one. It's larger than some of the others even, but 89% of people said yes on that. And our final question. In your work experience, have you seen projects suffer because people put their own needs ahead of team needs? What percentage said yes? 3, 2, 1, post your answer. All right, Meredith, give us the answer. 87% said yes. So 87% of people in that survey said that they had seen projects suffer because people put their individual needs over top of team needs. All right. So how did you do? Anybody come close? All right, Meredith, shall we move on to the next slide? All right, so here's just a little introduction to what we're going to talk about today. All of those survey questions reflect one of the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team. So we're going to talk about trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, and results, what those mean within teams, and why they matter for high-functioning, results-driven teams. You'll get a chance to reflect on your own teammate skills, because of course we all need to do these better, and you'll get some practical tips for moving your team, whether you're in a team member or leader, toward a more cohesive, results-driven way of working. Next slide. So why is teamwork important right now? Why is this a timely topic that we should be bringing? Why did Bates pick this to have me talk to you today about? Well, businesses are changing. It's no surprise after the last couple of years. The disruptions, market turbulence are challenging those established business models, and therefore organizations need to launch frequent transformations in response. We've seen changes toward virtual and hybrid teams, high turnover, this great resignation that everyone's talking about, new technologies. Next slide. And we're seeing that teams are moving from existing and skill set silos to teams that are made up of a combination of skill sets, really those cross-functional teams. And in order to adapt to how organizations are changing, we're seeing a need to help individuals and networks of teams. To work more effectively, we need those teams to share values and culture, to have transparent goals and projects, and to allow for lines of communication, to make for that free flow of information and feedback back and forth. Next slide. All right, so we're going to send you off to some breakout rooms. And you have 3 goals for this first breakout room. First, we would like you to introduce yourselves, choose a spokesperson who can come back and tell us a little bit about what you talked about in your group, and then to think about the teams that you've been on. So what are the characteristics of the best teams that you've been on? And what are the characteristics of the worst teams? And we're going to give you about 15 minutes for this breakout. So we'll see you back then. Do we have everybody back, Meredith?
Yes, it looks like we should
All right.
have everyone back.
All right, well, then we'll discuss some of your findings. We're going to do this in a little bit informal manner. So if someone wants to step up, what are some of the characteristics of the best and worst teams that you've all seen? And you might need to unmute yourself.
I can start. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so in my group with Eric, Marjorie, and Nina, some characteristics we discussed as far as having a well-functioning team, having trust in our colleagues and their expertise, having a good direction, a good clear direction that the team was all aware of. Having a skilled project manager, Nina mentioned she experienced that and it was absolutely wonderful. Having good mediation, respect and listening to one another, and a strong leader who can synthesize the group's ideas and then kind of put it into some clear next steps. A strong leader, definitely. And then for not so great characteristics, just not having clear direction. Some of us felt the Zoom setting and even masks have kind of hindered communication and just feeling cohesive. Not having a strong leader and turnover. Some of us have experienced teams with a lot of turnover, which definitely has kind of hindered the function of the team.
Yeah, thank you. All right, anybody else want to chime in?
I'll chime in with some notes that I took from the group of folks I met with. Our group was 4 people, Susan, Stephen, Joshua, and myself. Very different backgrounds. The qualities of the team leader or perhaps leaders were highlighted as pretty important. Objectives, intent, but also allowing space for the team to function and be creative, even with the rules of the team. We talked about the transitions and how when people are new to the team, you have to acclimate them to what those rules are. Someone brought up the idea of how it is that you as a team member landed on this team and the other team members. Was this voluntary? Was this obligatory? And that might influence the dynamics of the team. What else did we talk about? One thing that we didn't talk a lot about that I wanted to talk about was conflict. On teams that I've been on, how teams deal with conflict is maybe one of the most important characteristics, perhaps after leader. This is me talking about my group, but conflict is not a bad thing. And if members of your team view it that way, I don't know that it's a highly functioning team.
Yeah. All right, well, that was such a great lead in to our next slide. So we're just going to go ahead and move to the next slide, and the other groups will have a chance to chime in at our next couple of breakouts. So today we're going to be looking at the 5 behaviors model, and there are 5 behaviors that obviously make up this model: trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, and results. And this comes from the work of bestselling author and founder of the Table Group, Pat Lencioni. This particular model comes from his book, The 5 Dysfunctions, which is, many of you may be aware of it. If you're not, it is a great read. It's an easy read and a quick one. But he really has a model that outlines the crucial behaviors that we need to be attended to in order to develop this high-performing teams, the teams that get results consistently, and that get results without a lot of pain to get to those. So the true power of this model really stems from its simplicity, right? It's 5 behaviors. And it has power because it reminds us of things that we already know. We already are aware of these 5 behaviors. They're just things that we might not do well. As Lencioni likes to say, it's simple, but it's not easy to do. So cohesive teams master all 5 of these behaviors. Now, can you achieve results without the other 4? The answer is yes. There are definitely teams that achieve results without having a good level of trust, or maybe they don't engage in conflict, or they have all negative conflict, or maybe they're not accountable to each other. The issue is that the results won't be sustainable. So if you think about a raft of people going down a river, and the people in the raft are, maybe paddling at the wrong times, maybe somebody's not paddling at all, maybe they're, kind of paddling using wrong techniques or things like that. Can the raft make it to a particular point in the river? Well, the answer is probably yes. The current, in at least some cases, is going to take that raft to that point. They're going to achieve the result. But it might be a miserable experience to be in that raft, and it might take a lot longer than it should have. If, in contrast to if everyone was in that raft, paddling together, working toward that common goal, and moving in the same direction. And that raft might be able to get to that results easier, more quickly, and with a whole lot less pain. So we're going to go through each of the behaviors in this model, and you're going to get a little bit of some tips and ways of bringing this to your team, whether you are just a team member, you're a leader. Hopefully you walk away with some practical ways of introducing more of these behaviors on your team. All right, Meredith. So trust. Trust is our first, and it is our foundational behavior. Trust is really the behavior from which all of the others come from. If you don't have good trust, the other behaviors are going to be harder to achieve. Now, most of the time when we talk about trust in workplaces, we talk about predictive-based trust. And predictive-based trust means that I trust that you will act in a certain way. So a business owner might trust that one of their employees will be reliable at showing up on time. They might trust that someone always hits their deadline, or that someone generally connects well with clients. The trust that we're talking about here is a little different. Lencioni really advocates for a vulnerability-based trust. And if you've read or listened to Lencioni or Brene Brown or some of the others in this space, you already have an idea of what vulnerability-based trust is. Meredith? So vulnerability-based trust is a willingness to be completely vulnerable with one another, to let down your guard, admit flaws, and ask for help. It's the trust that the people around me are well-intentioned toward me, that they want you to succeed, they want me to succeed and do well. Everyone is on board together. There's no backstabbing or gossip or all of those negative sorts of behaviors that erode this type of trust. Next slide. So low trust teams typically hide mistakes. They are afraid to take risks. They don't help each other. They have poor communication, and they don't give the benefit of the doubt. So what are some of the consequences of having low trust? Well, they can be a kind of a painful experience. If you're not able to, if you have that poor communication, you might not know what's going on. If people are hiding their mistakes, those mistakes can have real consequences to what you're trying to achieve as a group. And it can just make the team experience a pretty miserable one. So we're going to put you back into your breakouts, and this is going to be a little bit shorter. We're going to go for about 10 minutes this time. Meredith, you can pop that slide up. Thank you. So the two questions that I want you to think about here is, why is trust important for a results-driven team? And two, what are some ways that you could increase trust on your team? And so see if you can come up with a couple of maybe tips or tricks on how you can increase trust. Maybe you do this on your team already, and you can bring some new ideas to other people's experiences. And so we'll go for about 10 minutes, and then we'll discuss those. All right, I think we got everybody back. So let's talk about what you came up with. Who would like to share, why is trust important for those results-driven team? How can trust help you get to that high-performing, high-functioning team? You may need to unmute. I think everyone's just being shy.
I think I'll start. I think in our group, I kind of dominated, unfortunately, but it was a lot about how the leader has an impact on the trust of the team. And if people don't trust him or her, then it's really hard for all of us sometimes to feel trust with each other. I think we do, and my team specifically, I think we do a pretty good job with that. But it's hard when it's not coming from the top. It's hard when we don't feel like he trusts us, and in return, we don't really trust him. So it makes it difficult.
Yeah. What else? Anybody else have a different response to that, or something along the lines of that you came up with in your group?
Our team, we talked about, let's see, trust, facilitating better communication, openness, transparency, and some ways to increase trust. When members of the team are all taking responsibility for their roles, sharing skills, whether it's, small or broader skills, for the team to feel they can have those tutorials or things accessible. Shared acknowledgement on success, the whole team feeling that they are part of that success, we also felt was important for trust. And sharing vulnerability as well.
Yeah. Anybody else? We can take one more, and then we'll.
The team with Joel, Jody, and myself, we did definitely talk about giving credit where it's due. As Nancy was just discussing, we also talked about, excuse me, making sure you're delivering the results, whether you're the leader or a team member. The leader modeling the way, doing your part, and just produce. And then leaders setting up their staff for success with the roles that they assign them, with the tasks that they give them out. And then when anyone makes a mistake, just admit it, regardless of who you are, and then just work together to move forward and ask for feedback throughout the assignment as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so when I think about why is trust important for those results-driven team, I think many of us have had experiences on low trust teams. And if you think about all of the energy that gets expended because you don't trust people, and what if you didn't have to expend all that energy on watching your own back, or having to try to interpret somebody's behavior, or all of those other pieces, and could actually apply it to results, to going toward what you needed to go for. All of that energy could be moved towards that in a more productive way. All right, Meredith, next slide. So here are a couple of trust tips that I'll share with you. And a couple of them we've already mentioned, but I'll start with personal history. So this is one thing that we do in the 5 behaviors facilitation when I do this with groups. And it's sharing something about yourself, putting yourself in a little bit of a vulnerable position with your teammates. And this often sounds really scary, and yet it is one of those really powerful exercises that teams seem to really love. So a couple of tips on how to do this. One is usually to have the leader go first to set the tone. You don't really need to share deep, dark secrets. You want a little bit of vulnerability, but you don't need to go to, the skeletons in the closet. And it may take a few times to get everybody comfortable with it. So I have a couple of different examples of things that you could ask in a group setting to help people become a little bit more vulnerable, to help them trust each other. One is to share a challenging aspect of their childhood. Was there a challenge or an issue that they dealt with as a child? Secondly, you could ask to have them talk about a time that they had made a mistake and maybe what that looked like or what the consequences were of that mistake. And finally, a time when they were frightened. And again, all these are just a little bit vulnerable. Hopefully it kind of puts a nice spot in there to introduce some vulnerability. I've did this with a team recently, a couple months ago, and it was a team that worked in a pretty emotionally heightened environment. And so most of them didn't show a lot of emotion. And I was really concerned about how this would go with them. Were they going to be able to share vulnerability with each other? One of the problems that they had identified was that their team gossiped too much. And so that, on top of the fact that they didn't show a lot of emotion, I thought, oh, this is going to go really bad. And it turned out to be probably the best exercise of that facilitation. They really got into it and share a lot of things. And I loved hearing afterwards where they were like, hey, I understand now why somebody does this thing that they do that used to annoy me. And now I understand a little bit of why they might do that. And it makes me feel a little different toward them. Or it just gives them a little bit of connection that they might not have had before. Somebody has a challenge. Oh, I have that challenge. I understand how that feels. And so that can be a great, just small exercise that can be introduced into a team meeting. Some of you mentioned you can create a culture of asking for help, starting at the top, going all the way down. Model that. Model admitting when you need help on something. Create a culture where people's strengths are valued and where you go to people for advice on the things that they're good at. And finally, normalizing those mistakes. So we all make mistakes. And making those mistakes and failures that happen when people are stretching and trying to get new things done, making those more accepted will benefit the team. Not only is it going to increase trust, but you're probably going to be more creative and more innovative on your team as well. Creativity and innovation are both risk-taking endeavors. And if you aren't seeing mistakes and failures, either your people are hiding it or you're really not taking the risks needed for good creativity, and you won't reach that potential that your team has. All right, Meredith. So on to conflict. And next slide. So when there is trust, team members are able to engage in unfiltered and constructive debate. Healthy conflict focuses on concepts and ideas to produce the best possible solution. So Lencioni likes to talk about a conflict continuum. There is, on the one hand, an absence of conflict, artificial harmony, where no one's really debating, no one's really sharing ideas, everybody is afraid of conflict. And on the other side is that negative, destructive conflict that gets personal. Most teams tend to stay at the artificial harmony, right? We're afraid of the negative conflict, particularly in the workplace. And so we exist in this artificial harmony where we're not really debating anything. We're not really sharing ideas to the extent that we should. Productive conflict on teams is somewhere in the middle on that continuum. The best and most productive conflict is going to be right on that line between good conflict and negative conflict, productive conflict, negative conflict. And teams will slide over into negative conflict from time to time. That's not a problem as long as you can take that team back into productive conflict. As a sociologist, we would talk about establishing norms, and that sometimes going over that norm helps you to see where that norm is. And so that's one of the pieces of productive conflict that we see. So we're gonna, Meredith, next slide. Do just a really short little activity here and talk about where you fall on the conflict or how you do conflict, your conflict style. So one of the challenges of conflict is that we often have complicated histories with conflict. And we may assume things about people based on how they handle conflict. So take a look at the continuum there. Where do you think you fall? Are you a spirited debater, or are you a calm debater, or are you someone in the middle? And I'll give you just a minute to think about that. And then I'm going to ask a couple of questions and hopefully hear from a few of you. All right, so let's start with those on the calm debater half of the continuum. If you disagree with someone's ideas, how do you let them know? And you may need to unmute, but you can shout out some answers.
My first response is to ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, anybody else? We have lots of spirited debaters. All right. Well, for the calm debaters, how might you typically feel when the conflict gets tense?
Stressed,
Mm-hmm.
anxious,
Yeah.
Defensive.
Defensive. Yeah. So I happen to be on that calm debater side as well. And it's, yeah, stress, anxiety. I often say that when, conflict gets too tense, I tend to shut down. And for some people who may not be a calm debater, that may seem like I'm not interested or invested in what we're talking about, or lack of interest. So there can be, again, we make assumptions based on what we see. So let's see about those spirited debaters. If you do disagree with somebody's ideas, how do you let them know?
I just say that I have a different idea. I mean, I'm sometimes pretty straightforward with it.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I've been told that I like sway back and forth where what I'm actually saying is calmer, but my face is very spirited.
Ah,
If I disagree with whatever it was that you said, before I get the chance to like put together what I would actually say to you out loud, my face has already told you what I think about your idea.
yeah. So how do you typically feel when conflict gets tense? For your spirited debaters, if it starts getting tense, how does it typically make you feel?
Anxious.
Anybody else?
Uncomfortable.
Okay. Yeah, so tense conflict can produce some of the same emotions. I've also done this with groups who have said, nope, you know what, I'm a spirited debater, and I actually kind of like it when stuff gets, when we have those good debates and we're really into it, and maybe things are a little bit tense, but I really like that. Again, it's those key differences that we've seen at different points of the continuum influence how we see other people. It influences how we react and we respond. And when we can understand more about people's style of conflict, it can help us engage in conflict more productively. So the object isn't to stop conflict, it's to get to a point where we can engage in conflict, but do it productively, so that we're able to make decisions and work through mistakes or potential problems that might exist in a project. And so that is an activity also that you could do with a group if you wanted to kind of learn about each other's conflict styles and how you feel about it. and get to some of those underlying assumptions about what people mean when they react in certain ways. All right, Meredith. Oh, sorry, didn't realize it did that. All right, so a couple of conflict tips. So one is to encourage productive conflict. And particularly if you're a leader, encouraging those debates, encouraging people to speak up, to give their opinions, to be willing to disagree on things. And the more that becomes a normal part of your team, the better off it is. As long as you're not venturing too far into that negative, personal-based attacks, you're going to be in a good spot for productive conflict. Secondly, explore where your own healthy conflict behaviors turn to unhealthy conflict behaviors. We all have them. Each of our particular conflict styles has healthy behaviors, and then it has points at which those behaviors become less healthy. So I'm a calm debater. I tend to be open to opinions, and I like to hear from people. But there are usually points where I will then drift into where I just kind of shut down. It's an unhealthy conflict behavior. Knowing what might trigger that, knowing where those lines are for me, what's going to make me shut down instead of staying in the conflict, can help me engage in that conflict more productively. And finally, set some ground rules. So as a team, decide what you're comfortable with. Is your team comfortable with raised voices, for example? Or is that a total non-go? What's the protocol if things get too heated? Do you want to say, have a code word that you could say and everyone takes a 5 or 10 minute break? What's acceptable and unacceptable to the team when you're engaging in conflict? And the more that you can establish those ground rules, the more comfortable everyone becomes with being able to engage with that productive conflict. All right, Meredith. Commitment. This is our third behavior. And next slide. So commitment is when team members are able to offer opinions and debate those ideas. When there's trust, they will be more likely to commit to the decisions and the team itself. It's not necessary to achieve consensus. That's often a misconception of achieving commitment. You don't necessarily need consensus to get people to commit, but clarity and buy-in are key. So what happens when commitment isn't reached? Well, say a leader wants to implement a change. Without clarity, team members may not know who is responsible for what, or how the change will be achieved, or what actually has to be done. Without buy-in, people may decide that they'll just continue to do it the old way because that's what works for them, or they may not put a full effort into this new change because they think that the new way is going to fail, or because they think it's going to, or they think that there's a problem, no one's listening to their concerns, and so they're just going to let it fail because no one's listening. So when teams engage in healthy conflict, they have that opportunity to air their ideas and opinions. When people feel heard, they're more likely to commit to team decisions, even those with which they initially disagree. Two key factors of commitment are that buy-in and clarity, and team members must be willing to support the team decisions. Everyone's got to be on the same page, though, about what those decisions are and what the plans are. All right, Meredith. Oh, and we're slowly running out of time. So I'm just going to quickly go over, this is an activity you can also use to promote clarity on your team. And it involves using 2 sets of note cards. One says, go get it. The other says, get over it. And essentially, if you have a decision or something that you need clarity and buy-in on. So imagine that your team has just decided on the direction of its new project. And you're looking at a series of possible concerns about that decision. For each one, you just determine whether you should speak up in order to go get whatever you're missing, or whether you need to get over the uncertainty. So you have a new initiative, for example, and you're not sure who's responsible for moving that project forward. Each team member gets a vote. Is it get over it or go get it? In this case, the answer would be to go get it. You actually need the information about who's responsible for moving that project forward. But if it were something where it was just uncertainty, you would get over it. Everybody has a say, and you move on from there. All right, Meredith. Okay, and we have one more breakout. Just looking at the clock here. Let's do a quick breakout of about 5 minutes. And if you can quickly discuss these two topics, why is commitment important for results-driven teams? And what are some ways you could increase commitment on your team? All right, I think we lost some people, had to leave, so we'll jump back in. Hopefully everybody is back. And just in the effort of keeping this within the time period, we'll just skip ahead. I'm not going to have your report on that breakout because I wanted to give you some commitment tips and then move on to accountability and results before our time ends. So some commitment tips. One is to hear opinions and ideas. Ask for people to share those. Secondly, make sure everyone has clarity. And that's where that go get it or get over it activity can be a great way to ensure that everybody knows what's going on, who's responsible for what, and what's going to happen. And finally, set some ground rules for commitment. And this, I have a really quick example that I'll share. I was working with a company and they had an emerging leader who was really struggling with some of her teammates. And one of the things when I talked to her, one of the things she brought up was, I feel like I have more of a commitment to what's going on than the people around me. I'm doing more, I'm, keeping track of things on weekends and they're not. And so I'm more committed than what they are. So one of the things that will help that is to set some of the ground rules for commitment. In her case, she was very dedicated. There wasn't an issue there, but she was single and her coworkers were married with families and had other things going on. She had less and really focused on work as some of her primary social output. And so her commitment there was she just spent more time doing it than what others had. So establishing those ground rules for commitment, whether it's when are we going to respond to messages? Do I need to respond on a weekend or an evening? Are we going, or just do responses need to come in like within 24 hours on a business day? How are we going to share common resources like budgets? If there's a conflict, how are we going to deal with that? All of those things, even meeting, how you'll handle meetings. Can you bring laptops into a meeting? All of these seem really simple, but they can establish those ground rules for how committed people are to the team and what expectations you have for them. All right, Meredith. All right, so accountability. We often assume that leaders hold people accountable, and that's typically what happens in most teams. But on cohesive teams, team members are responsible for holding each other accountable, and it actually takes pressure off of the leader. Team members must be willing to call on one another on their behavior and performance that isn't up to those agreed upon standards, particularly when they hurt the team. All right, Meredith. So just a couple of tips for how you can improve accountability and get everybody holding each other accountable. One is to practice giving and receiving feedback. And again, this seems really simple, but it's something that most of us don't do on a regular basis, particularly with our teammates. We may not be comfortable giving negative feedback to a teammate. We may not be comfortable calling out a teammate for not doing their best on a project. The more that you can practice giving and receiving feedback and making it just a very normal part of team activities, the better able everyone will be to holding each other accountable on it. The second is to make sure that you're using positive and constructive feedback. So you don't want all the feedback to be just constructive or negative. You want to use positive feedback in there so that feedback doesn't become a negative thing by itself, so that everyone is getting the benefit of having positive feedback for what they're doing, feeling valued, feeling that they're being recognized for what they're doing well, and getting constructive feedback on the things that maybe they can improve on. And creating that shared understanding of accountability. And here again, it's what does accountability look like? How can we create a shared understanding of what that is going to be on our team? One of the teams that I mentioned earlier worked on this, and they came up with some ground rules that were like, hey, if we're going to give constructive feedback, we want the person to give it to us one-on-one. There's no large group constructive feedback. It goes one-on-one. If you have positive feedback, that can be given, within a larger group. And the other thing that they came up with was if someone's giving feedback, it goes directly to that person, and I'm not talking about it with other people. And that was a team that had a problem with some gossip. And so that was one of the ways that they chose to work around that. Meredith? And finally, on to results. And we can pop right to the next slide as well. So the ultimate goal of building greater trust, healthy conflict, commitment, and accountability is the achievement of results. Team members need to make collective results their top priority. They all have to paddle in that same direction in the raft in order to achieve those results. Next slide. So results are our ultimate goal. To excel, all team members must be able to put their team goals ahead of those individual goals. And many teams struggle with this, even when they are achieving results. And Meredith, I think we can skip ahead 2 slides to 38. So what are some tips for results? How can you get to that high-performing, results-driven team that everybody wants? It all starts with trust. Trust and conflict are really the 2 most important behaviors on this model. If you can master those 2, accountability, commitment, and results will follow. You may need to do some work there, but really the bulk of the work is going to happen with trust and productive conflict. Focusing on team results and how individual efforts contribute. So when you're calling out individual efforts and recognizing people for their contributions, connect it to the team results. Don't just say, hey, you did a great job on this particular task, but talk about how that particular task and when they did it well, how that contributed to the team results, how it got you to that achieved goal. And finally, review team progress and keep the scoreboard front and center. So teams do this in a lot of different ways. I've worked on teams that have had dashboards and Smartsheet. I've worked on some that have had blackboards put up, but you want a scoreboard that's keeping track of team progress on at least some measure that you can all look at. It's front and center, it's right in front of you, and it becomes the focus of the team so that you're all heading in that same direction. All right, and I know those last ones were quick, but we're right on time here to get a couple of questions in. And Meredith, you can move. Thank you. So if anyone, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, feel free to put your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask them.
Melissa, I have a question because I'm also a training and development professional. Did you get certified in this, the 5 dysfunctions or whatever of team?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team is an assessment. Wiley has actually 2 different assessments, and I'm an accredited facilitator for that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And so do you use this to facilitate teams, in different organizations?
Yeah. So the assessments, there are 2 different assessments. One is a personal development, and that can be a team facilitation. I've also used it with individuals who are just really struggling with how to team with the people around them. And that kind of tracks, how can I improve? And then there's a team, 5 behaviors of cohesive development, that really focuses on team. So all of the results are tabulated together, they're anonymous. It really focuses on the team behaviors. And you go through that as a team. And that one's a little bit more intensive of a program, but very useful for the teams that I've gone through it with.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sure. So I was wondering about how these dynamics play out differently when you have standing teams that will go after multiple sets of goals and results versus temporary teams and ad hoc, where we're here to accomplish a single thing and then we're going to disperse again.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say in general, these are probably most applicable to longstanding teams. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't take many of the tips or tricks that I talked about and use them on more temporary teams. So for example, I led freelance and contract teams for a long period of time. And we used a lot of these little tips and tricks, setting guidelines. We didn't necessarily, dive into developing a lot of trust because there just wasn't time. But there are still tips that you can use on that. But yeah, to get the full effect of using these behaviors, you're probably talking about teams that are together for a period of time, have a cohesive set of goals. There may be some cross-functional aspects to that, but are established.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question if someone has it? Okay. So I want to thank Melissa very much for being a part of this and providing this wonderful program for us. I also want to thank Ian Shields and Lighthouse for being such great collaborators with us through this effort. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating. Thank you so much. I hope that you found a lot to take away and that will be helpful to you as you return to your own teams. Please be on the lookout in the days ahead. We're going to send a follow-up email, which will include a recording of the program, a survey for you to take as we evaluate how this professional development series is working for all of you and us, and then some special discounts that will be available to you for your participation. So thank you again very much, and I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.